The United States has absolutely botched the official cap on the war in Afghanistan. It's no secret people on both sides of the political aisle agree this whole process has been one long nightmare for the United States. The entire world is looking at us questioning what happened to the world's most quote-unquote powerful country. I feel like pretty much everybody is stunned at what really has taken place in Afghanistan with the United States, the withdrawal, the war, everything. From the day that this whole war has started, the United States has been tripping over its own feet. They've been failing to meet their own expectations, and honestly, we've failed the world's vision of America being the sole superpower and supermilitary on Earth. The United States spends exponentially more money on its military than any other nation on the planet, yet most people agree that they've lost a war against an enemy that on paper should have been easy to obliterate. I mean, it literally took us a couple of months the first time around to displace their entire government and take the country over. But after 20 years, the Taliban is back. They've taken the country back over. The United States has lost the war. American morale in the war has been quite hectic over the years to begin with. I mean, many Americans still feel that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were necessary due to the September 11th terrorist attacks. And many other Americans have viewed this conflict and global mission as a waste of taxpayer money and another historical embarrassment for the government of the United States. It is insane to think about how different a country the United States would be had the September 11th terrorist attacks never happened. The legacies of Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden would be drastically different if even still actually even existent. World history would vastly change. It wouldn't even really be the same world that we live in today. I mean, it is hard, though, to predict exactly what and where America would be, but personally, I predict it would be a country with massively less political tension, political divide, and perhaps even different political views. The war in Afghanistan has likely hugely impacted the political views of Generation Z in a massive way after they've grown up in the post-9/11 society that we see today that's had two massive global recessions, increases in many different types of tensions, tragedy after tragedy, and more. The war in Afghanistan was officially started on October 7th, 2001 when the United States invaded Afghanistan following the terror attacks in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. Other nations were also involved in the invasion, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and with the supports of nations such as Iran, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Turkmenistan. George Bush's presidential approval rating had recently skyrocketed to 90% after the terror attacks in his presidential address to the nation that followed, in which the American people rallied around the call for strength, unity, and force against those responsible. For months afterward, his approval ratings still held pretty high, and for this short period of time, George Bush had become the most popular president out of anyone since 1937. The second closest was his father, George H.W. Bush, who was the 41st president. Early in the war, it appeared that America was accomplishing the mission fairly well. Within a short period of time, the United States and the supporting allies had toppled the Taliban-led government and forced them to respond with sort of an insurgency on the run in 2004. But many things have gone wrong since then, and the United States today is trying to save face as quickly as possible, exiting what is considered the longest uninterrupted conflict participation in American history. Technically, the United States fought the American Indian Wars for over 300 years until 1924. However, the fighting was intermittent and broke up, therefore it's oftentimes not considered the actual longest American war. The questions have started to truly arise from the American people, though. What did our nation get out of the conflict in the Middle East? Was killing Osama bin Laden enough when the Taliban retook their country in mere weeks? Al-Qaeda still exists, and other terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State have popped up. Was this conflict worth thousands of Americans to give their lives, tens of thousands to be injured or wounded in some form, and for the trauma that it's caused to a nation already reeling from crisis after crisis? Current President Joe Biden has recently been taking an extreme level of flack for his administration's handling of the pullout in Afghanistan, but is he solely responsible for the entire thing? Who in America or in the world deserves to take the fall for the horrific situations that we've seen? Will America be able to recover from such a crisis? Well, let's go ahead and just start digging into it. The American people have been rightfully angry for what happened on September 11th, 2001 for 20 full years in just a few short days. when thousands of innocent civilians were brutally massacred on commercial airliners in the Twin Towers and the surrounding areas, at the Pentagon, in a field in Pennsylvania, first responders bravely trying to save lives, there is reason to be upset. When thousands of Americans have been sent to the Middle East to serve their country and are killed, and those that came back have had their backs turned on them by their country and their government, there's reason to be angry. When your entire way of life has been quickly disrupted and ultimately changed due to something that happened this long ago, you have a reason to be angry. The truth of the matter is, the United States government failed its people with the September 11th terrorist attacks. There are many conspiracies that, terrorists were never genuinely responsible for it, that President Bush ordered the attacks, the United States allowed it to happen, so much more, but I really don't want to spend this video digging through these conspiracies. I want to talk more about the fact that the United States government blatantly failed the nation on that day. Not only did the United States government have an extreme level, honestly, of actionable intel that such terrorist attacks could be planned and take place, but it also had been intel they'd received years prior to the terror attacks even happening. In December of 1998, the Clinton administration was rocked by reports from the CIA's Counter-Terrorist Center that potential terrorist flight hijackings were being prepared by Al-Qaeda, the group who later committed the 9/11 attacks. This was nearly 3 years before the actual attacks ever even occurred. In April of 2001, the leader of an enemy of the Taliban, the Northern Alliance, shared a warning from their leader to European Parliament in Belgium that included a request for humanitarian aid, but also included a stark warning that intel suggested there would be a large-scale terrorist attack that could take place immediately on the United States' own soil. Tragically, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, was later assassinated by Al-Qaeda terrorists just 2 days before the 9/11 attacks, and only months after he warned the Europeans of what was to happen next. President George Bush was told on May 1st, 2001 that a US-based terrorist group was planning an attack. In a daily brief given to President Bush on June 29th, 2001, it was suggested that, quote, an interview that month with a Middle Eastern journalist in which bin Laden aides warned of a coming attack, as well as competitive pressures that the terrorist leader was feeling, given the number of Islamists that were being recruited for the separatist Russian region of Chechnya. The CIA went on to claim, basically, that these attacks were imminent and would have, quote, dramatic consequences. Obviously, the attacks would happen just a few short months later, and they would have some of the most dramatic consequences of any event in global history. On July 10th, 2001, the CIA's director and counterterrorism chiefs met with the current National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. This meeting detailed intelligence that proved Al-Qaeda was planning to attack the United States imminently. Condoleezza Rice, instead of listening to these concerns and taking action, instead prioritized other issues that were facing her desk and ignored this advice from one of the most important investigative branches in the world. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld believed that the information was essentially false information fed to the United States meant to see how military leaders would respond in such a scenario to kind of scout them out, and also decided not to act on it. On August 6th, 2001, yet again at a daily briefing for the president titled, quote, Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S., it was described that bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda operatives were immediately mobilizing a terrorist attack in the United States, which included FBI information that suggested the patterns of activity were consistent with planning for hijacking aircraft. Condoleezza Rice, who once again saw this information, replied to this by saying that it was, quote, not prompted by any specific threat information and that it, quote, did not raise the possibility that terrorists might use planes as missiles. Unfortunately, as we all know now, the terrorists that these people were warned about for years did use planes as missiles. Merely 36 days later, 4 commercial airliners were used as missiles by 19 hijackers to kill 2,996 Americans and injure a further 25,000. Government agencies had suggested that this was planned, imminent, and real for years before the attacks, yet, of course, nobody listened, nobody reacted, and frankly, nobody cared. Until it did happen. Until the United States faced the bloodiest terror attack in world history and faced the longest conflict that it had ever been involved in. Americans were, and rightfully have been, mad. Many, however, are completely ignorant to the failures and wrongdoings of its government that, had they never happened, may have prevented this entire timeline in global history from even happening. The US economy was damaged by $3 trillion. Two icons of the United States in the Twin Towers were completely destroyed after collapsing in the attacks. Things could never really be the same. America united after the 9/11 attacks in a way that may never truly happen ever again. American humanitarian efforts swelled, people across the nation donated blood or traveled to New York to help the rescue efforts. Money was raised for the victims of the attack, and it appeared that behind the might of the United States, America was about to kick some ass like never before. Throughout the tragedies of what's happened since then, the average American has not been given the proper answers as to what the government is going to do to actually make any of these situations better in any way. Sure, Bush gave his speech and rallied the country behind him, but by time that his presidency came to a halt, he had an approval rating of 25%, one of the lowest since 1937. 20 years later, it's hard to imagine that most Americans feel any form of pride about what we've done in Afghanistan and such. A serious failure of the country has occurred throughout this whole process, and as a result, trillions of dollars in taxpayer dollars have essentially gone to waste, and families now have to cope with the loss or permanent change of many of their loved ones that served in the conflict. Even soldiers that weren't killed, the post-traumatic stress disorders that may face them may make them feel as if they're social outcasts, lead to potential homelessnesses, may lead to damaged and broken families that struggle, if not outright fail to heal, and tragic suicides that should never be as prominent as they are. People who've served this country have been failed. Afghanistan veterans are coming home and suffering daily for their service. Much of this is been, I guess, in a rush of patriotism following what happened to our country, but the want to defend their families and loved ones and their country from a threat across the world has permanently scarred an obscene amount of young American men and women. Through all of the questions, the lies, even the truths, the war, the blood, everything, Americans have suffered from the conflict in Afghanistan. A country that once thought it would win this war easily and prove the greatness of America on a global scale is watching in horror as evacuation efforts have resulted in several servicemen being brutally murdered in suicide bombings by Islamic State affiliates. Afghan civilians would rather cling to the side of American aircrafts and face certain death than to face the leadership of the Taliban, which reports suggest have systemically gone from door to door to find and execute Afghans who have worked with or cooperated with the United States during the country's occupation. As of the writing of this part of this video, Americans still remain in the country, and a genuine crisis has unfolded in the Middle East, trying to wrap up the end of another crisis. There have been worries that another imminent terror attack will happen at any minute, according to the United States government. President Joe Biden has been on the hot seat for the crisis in Afghanistan, and rightfully so. During the unfolding of the crisis as the Taliban took full control of Afghanistan, President Joe Biden went on a long vacation to his home in Wilmington, Delaware, where he initially refused to answer media questions and to make any sort of statement on the crisis that was endangering American civilians, soldiers, and allies. Much of the country has since felt that Joe Biden's handling of the situation was poor. According to Rasmussen reports, 34% of Americans currently believe that the country is headed in the right direction, and nearly 1 in 10 Biden voters have expressed regret for their vote in the 2020 election. 39% of likely United States voters actually believe that Biden is currently running the country, while 51% of likely United States voters believe that the presidential decisions for Joe Biden are being determined and planned by other people on his behalf. Support for Joe Biden has wavered, and quickly. It's no surprise why recently this clip of Joe Biden at a press conference came out where he openly admitted that a roster had been selected for him to call on media questions, starting with an NBC reporter.
Ladies and gentlemen, they gave me a list here. The first person I was instructed to call on was Kelly O'Donnell of NBC.
The President of the United States is being openly instructed on who he can call on. Do people not see a problem with this? I mean, I surely do. Much of Biden's blame has been directed on the now collapsed Afghanistan government and armed forces, essentially noting that their military collapsed under the pressure of the Taliban and literally fled cities and gave up surrendering if confronted. An obscene amount of American weapons and military equipment left for the Afghan forces were abandoned to be claimed by the Taliban. The president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country without even telling US officials or top Afghan leadership, fearing the bloodshed that would likely ensue against him and his people after the Taliban overtook the presidential palace of the nation. Biden is not inherently wrong in blaming the collapse of Afghanistan on the government that Afghanistan was controlled by. It's just intentionally misleading people on the amount of failure indirectly responsible against the United States. This Afghan government was not built by itself. Sure, the Afghan people may have voted for their president and whatnot, but don't get it twisted. It was a complete packaged product that had been propped up by the United States and their armed coalitions. The United States rebuilt the national government in Afghanistan and largely supplied, funded, and trained its national security forces. The system that the US designed flat out failed. So yes, while Afghanistan's prior government holds responsibility for a lot of what happened, the United States also holds that blame for creating a government and military that was so weak-footed that it would collapse so fast. Especially considering they spent trillions of dollars doing this and spent 2 decades as well doing so. America would like for the world to believe that this Afghan collapse wasn't due to their propping up of this government that failed so hard, but it genuinely was. I find it hard to not blame our government for this issue. It's been very public that corruption was rife within the Afghan government and military. Most of the major officials in the American projects were extremely corrupt people. Afghanistan had led the war in its nation after NATO and the US handed them control in 2014, meaning that for going on 7 years now, Afghanistan has largely determined its future in this conflict. The support, however, was honestly all that really kept Afghanistan free. A major issue within Afghanistan's military was the inability to keep true loyalty. Many members of the Afghan forces were loyal to 2 separate parties. Either they were loyal to their country, they were loyal to the idea of a unified Afghanistan, that wasn't led by the Taliban, that wasn't led by terrorists. That was a democracy that had its own determination, that built its own freedom, that was going to lead its own future. Or they were loyal to local warlords and terrorists and people who basically were bullies and leaders of gangs. Many of the soldiers enlisted in these Afghan security forces didn't even exist. They were called ghost soldiers, and they were simply names on payrolls so that Afghan military leaders could still collect a paycheck for overseeing something that didn't exist. And let's be honest, who do you think paid for this? The United States largely did. In fact, the United States was obligated to pay $4 billion per year to maintain the Afghan forces that really don't even exist anymore. Also, as of the end of 2020, the US was announced to have spent $88.3 billion reconstructing Afghanistan's government security forces, which was nearly 62% of US reconstruction funding. Most of these Afghan soldiers were poorly trained and ill-equipped. Reports suggest that they either didn't understand how to use the United States' technology, or they just simply weren't taught well enough how to use it, and were simply rushed onto a battlefield with no loyalty to be churned into a war machine because the United States was there. The truth is, the United States did not build a functioning government and security force in Afghanistan. They built corrupt puppet states rife with corruption and uncertain loyalties. The military largely was not loyal to the new Afghan society and government. They were loyal to whoever was nearby. The leaders of this Afghan government cowered away and collapsed. They fled the country when they found it convenient. When they thought that it was their neck on the line, when they were the next to be killed by the Taliban, they fled. And guess what? They didn't tell the Americans. They didn't even tell their own people. They straight up left. The American experiment failed miserably. Afghanistan fell. And of course, we have seen the aftermath. But that leads us, I guess, into a massive question, right? Who is to blame for all of this? What Americans are at fault for this? I mean, it's an American experiment. What Americans are at fault for this? Of course, people are to blame in America for the mishandling of this situation, for the trillions of taxpayer dollars wasted, for the disturbing amount of life lost, for all of it. However, there isn't one singular person. It's an entire government. It would be easy to just say, oh, Biden did it all, right? Or, oh, Trump did it all, or it's all Obama's fault. But realistically, that's just not the case. There's a lot of people to blame for this. And the failures in the United States are a calculated failure that hundreds, if not thousands, of American government officials actively took place in. There are several notable government figures spanning 2 decades. There are 4 separate presidents and their administrations. They are military leaders. They are politicians, Democrat and Republican. Of course, they're not, regular everyday people. They're not your neighbor. They're not your brother or your cousin. The people in power over the course of all of this are really the ones to blame. Security branches in the upper tier of government from the late 1990s to the 2020s are responsible. From the people who ignored the repeated warnings before September 11th, to the presidents who have shifted blame off of themselves while still feeding this nightmare tax dollars and fresh Americans to bleed out for a country that honestly wouldn't piss on them if they were on fire, and to officials in office who have turned the other cheek while the military-industrial complex profited off of the carnage. Starting with President George W. Bush, many presidents have been to blame. I mean, yes, Bush did rally great support from the nation, sure. However, these master goals that he set out under his administration and military officials did not succeed. 20 years later, not entirely his fault, the Taliban once again now control Afghanistan. However, 4 times throughout 2001 was this attack predicted, if not outright told to be happening in some capacity, sometimes directly to the president himself, yet no control over the situation was presented. 2 wars were started in the Middle East with disastrous effects on the American nation. George Bush demanded the Taliban to give up the Al-Qaeda operatives who were responsible for 9/11 instead of sheltering them, a demand that did go ignored by the Taliban and later led to the invasion of Afghanistan. But by the time that George Bush left office, 30,000 U.S. troops were staged in Afghanistan in a now years-long conflict that was preparing to defend against a Taliban resurgence and was getting ready to get passed on to a new presidency. President Barack Obama was really not much better with his handling of the situations that he inherited starting in 2009. Facing pressure from military officials, Obama greenlighted the deployment of tens of thousands more American troops into Afghanistan over the following years. He initially planned to pull out of Afghanistan entirely throughout 2011, but obviously this would not happen at all during the Obama presidency, and actually still remains one of the major failures of the Obama administration to deliver on promises made to the American people. One of the major wins during the Obama administration that America still totes as a big victory throughout this whole thing, however, was the Pakistan Navy SEAL raid that led to the assassination of the mastermind of 9/11, Osama bin Laden. In May 2011, America accomplished one of the primary goals under Obama's direct order made on April 29th. They got him. Osama bin Laden was killed from a raid that started in Afghanistan. And while conspiracies still swirl that Osama bin Laden was never really killed by the Obama administration and he's still alive in some capacity, the official story is that he was at the side of a helicopter, so essentially, Osama got a couple bullets put inside of him and was turned into shark feed. However, this was, of course, not the end of what happened in Afghanistan. This was not the end of the war. Of course, the mastermind of 9/11 went down, but the Taliban still existed. Al-Qaeda still existed. ISIS was emerging. Terrorism was still a threat. Obama did announce a plan that would eventually lead to the full American withdrawal by the time that he left office, and he did hand over major combat operation control to Afghanistan on December 31st, 2014. However, things changed throughout the presidency over the years. The situation in Afghanistan was deemed too risky for the Americans to fully leave, and Obama ended his presidency failing to fully end the conflict that he promised to and left Donald Trump with the war and 10,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. Now, President Trump kind of took the gloves off in a pretty major way, but also had his shortcomings as president as well, marking only the first time that the Moab was ever used in combat. According to media outlets, it supposedly killed dozens of enemy fighters and crippled the capacities of the Islamic State in the region. In 2019, under the Trump administration, the United States dropped a record 7,423 bombs on Afghanistan. At the same time, Trump and his administration also helped negotiate the withdrawal deal with the Taliban that is widely spoken of today. This pretty much was done without the Afghan government, which angered them severely, but in February 2020, a deal was struck that would trade American withdrawal for Taliban cuts in violence and to end ties with terror groups. It notably wasn't protective of the concept that the Taliban could lie, though. In this deal as well, President Trump was also heavily criticized for negotiating the release of 5,000 Taliban fighters during his time in office as well, which is a statistic that is being often brought back up by Biden supporters to point blame on the former president for much of the issue that's happening today. While of course this is a terrible statistic across the board, Biden still has to own up to what happened on his watch, and speaking of, President Joe Biden inherited this mess. That much is true. He was not the first president to deal with this. but he is going to be the last, understandably. But that isn't necessarily a valid excuse for the horrible execution of the sped-up process of withdrawing American troops and allies. Under his command, 6,000 US troops were redeployed back into Afghanistan to help with evacuation efforts, which have been largely struck with tragedy and anger by the American public. The deadline of August 31st stood, and as of me writing this, thousands still await evacuation, which as of me now recording this, was supposedly fully completed ahead of schedule, and the United States has completed the full evacuation and is officially out of Afghanistan. The truth is, 4 presidencies have mishandled this situation. It's not to be blamed on any one individual. This is a group effort, and it was a group failure. Many things could have been handled better across the board, and the failure that we've seen will permanently, I think, mar the image of the United States on a global scale. Our largest allies watched our efforts die in vain, with thousands of dead soldiers and trillions spent for the same outcome to arrive 2 decades later. Our enemies are celebrating their victory, hanging on to our military equipment abandoned by our Afghan security force project. Estimates suggest that the United States spent $2.26 trillion in Afghanistan throughout the duration of the wartime operations. The country collapsed faster than anyone, including the government and military leaders, anticipated. 20 years for nothing. Americans have the right to be pissed. By this time, I've spent a great portion of this document/video detailing the critical failures of the United States government to prevent and react to the issues that we've discussed in this video. I've laid out a solid foundation starting before even I was alive, all the way until today. However, during the writing and recording of this video, a bombshell report has come out that has fundamentally changed the entirety of this video and will probably absolutely stun you. The fall of Kabul was the final blow to the government of Afghanistan, the final moments before the Taliban fully controlled the nation again, and the last nanoseconds before the embarrassment fell squarely on the backs of the United States. However, it turns out that the United States not only could have peacefully prevented it during a conversation with the Taliban, but could have potentially saved hundreds of lives, reorganized the terrible withdrawal efforts on its own schedule and pace, prevented the terrorist attack that killed US soldiers and Afghan civilians, and would have fundamentally changed the entire outcome of this situation. The truth is, Kabul was never actually captured by the Taliban. As we all believed, at least. From what we read in the media, we were to believe that the Taliban was marching through the streets, securing checkpoints and police stations and other government buildings with virtually no counterforce against them. Kabul was a pushover capture. However, the truth is Kabul was surrendered to the Taliban by the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and Kenneth McKenzie, the commander of the United States Central Command. Yes, the city where hundreds of people have died since the Taliban have taken control could have been controlled, patrolled, and overall saved by US troops as the withdrawal took place. More lives could have potentially been saved. America didn't have to force an August 31st deadline that was barely met. America didn't have to leave anyone behind that they didn't want to. This could have taken place on their timing. They would just have to be responsible for the entirety of it, according to the Taliban. And the United States of America refused accountability for the situation at the direction of the president. According to the Washington Times, it all took place when a meeting was arranged among top US military leaders and Abdul Ghani Baradar, the leader of the Taliban's political wing. Baradar told the Americans that there were only 2 ways that Kabul could be situated, either under American responsibility and control, or the Americans were to allow the Taliban to come in and do it themselves. The decision really came down to President Biden, the commander-in-chief. At the time, the president was unconvinced to change his mind by the quicker-than-anticipated collapse of the announced that this is not the last of prepared strikes meant to avenge these soldiers. While writing and recording this video, another strike recently happened that, according to news outlets, potentially killed upwards of 10 civilians while also killing a car suicide bomber, and the potential for more US airstrikes are still there even after the US has formally got to end just as it is now. American withdrawal and further reoccupation of Afghanistan by the opponents of the United States. At the end of the day, a solid point rings true. You cannot help people who do not want help. Of course, not to get this twisted, thousands of Afghans look to the United States for protection after valiantly helping our efforts to rebuild their country and to combat terrorism, quote unquote. But the military force we built and the government we propped obviously held no loyalty to their country. They were not people willing to die for their country, as many nation soldiers would. They were not willing to fight for a better future for their country. They fled. They were poorly trained and sometimes outright uncooperative. They were corrupt. They held loyalties to warlords. They committed fraud. They abandoned their country when it mattered most. It's not a total surprise, even to American intelligence sources, but the speed in which it happened is. The Taliban now control Afghanistan and will almost guarantee commit countless human rights violations, killing those who oppose them, if not outright suppressing their human rights, and crack down on civil liberties across the board. They've done it before and are showing signs of doing it again. Afghanistan will suffer, surely. However, fault lies on people who will not face accountability for it. Most Americans are more worried debating which president was better or which political party to follow than to critique any and all presidents who actually failed, which, to be honest, is every president that's had any sort of extensive touch, I guess, on this topic. It's been a disaster, but it's finally over. The United States has formally gotten its final flights out of Afghanistan, and the withdrawal is complete. Taliban Afghanistan is sealed as a sure thing. America ended the war, and the future is what's ahead. Many questions still lay, but I hope that this video was at least able to clear some of it up and provide some new perspective for you. Regardless of political leaning, I think we can all agree this situation hurt the United States as a country, and we did not execute everything properly. We did not do what we should have done, and we need to hold our government accountable for that. With that being said, though, thank you guys for watching this video. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're brand new around here on the channel, follow me over on Twitter and Twitch at SubToOptimus. Make sure to check out Shop Opti down below. And until my next video, guys, this is Optimus Well, talking about Afghanistan and signing out.